that's when things started to really get hotted up, because that's when the tent embassy was created. Because the people that were dragged and kicked and smashed in the head and kicked in the body, you know, by police, just for this one piece of little cloth that said it was the Aboriginal tent embassy. Well, in the early 70s, you had some wonderful people, like the Coes. Paul was going to uni to do all his stuff to get things ready for him to come out as a U-Butte lawyer, and he had the support of his family, especially his mum and his auntie Shirley Smith, and of course his grandmother Ethel Wedge. So, you know, he had, in actual fact, when you think of it, it was all the women that supported him, and they were all his immediate family of grandparents and mother and his aunties. So, you know, it was a great thing for a young boy in them days to be known that he was part and parcel of the beginning of things to start for Aboriginal peoples. And of course, Gary ended up being one of the greatest leaders that I can think of, and still is to this day, looking after the rights and the well-being of Aboriginal youth. So yeah, we had some really strong Aboriginal young men who were doing those things, as well as Cecil Patton. He was part too of everything that was happening there. You know, they had the help too of a lot of great other people. Gordon Briscoe, who was one of the people that just wanted to make sure that everything was done, and he was at the beginning of the starting of, you know, the AMSs, Redfern Aboriginal Medical Service down there. And of course we had lots of other non-Indigenous people, lawyers working there. You had lawyers too who worked within offices out in the country. Now these people had to move from A to B and C real fast because they had to travel. And I thought they were just marvellous people who went from one place to another to make sure that Aboriginal people were well represented. Redfern wanted an office up here. We started it off in Queanbeyan, and that office consists of Arnold Williams, Louise Brown as the secretary, and of course Jim Jeffries. So from the beginnings of that tiny little thing that grew in Redfern, from some, you know, from all those wonderful people, and I've got to give it to them, you know, like, that they really started off something great. And then in 1972, that's when things started to really get hotted up, because that's when the tent embassy was created. And lots and lots and lots of going to courts over it, because the people that were dragged and kicked and smashed in the head and kicked in the body, you know, by police, just for this one piece of little cloth that said it was the Aboriginal tent embassy, not the words actually, but just that little piece of cloth, you know, and I guess you know, it was, the first one really was an old beach umbrella that people like a wonderful guy called Billy Craigie and I think Tony Ferguson and others that were there. And of course Gary Foley was another guy that in those times with Solly Blair and had my brothers Arnold and Crow. But you know, and well, we all were there, but they're the people that really stood their ground, and of course a wonderful guy from down the south coast, Bobby McLeod. Yeah, and all this. And when I'm saying these names, I'm saying these people's names because when they came up, they brought all their mob with them. And so everybody had somebody there in 1972 when the tent, and of course the police could pick you up just if you look sideways, because in them days they didn't trust Aboriginal people and Aboriginal people didn't trust them. So it was an ongoing fight for years and years and years. No, we had a Wide Australia policy, darling. So it's set up by the wonderful party of the Labor Party, Mr Corwell. And you know, it didn't address Aboriginal people at all because we were still part of the flora and fauna. And people came on board and even worked there voluntarily, you know, to make, you know, to help and make sure that Aboriginal people would, and their children would grow up in a place where they weren't treated any differently to any other people in Australia. But the struggle still goes on. The struggle still goes on because we still don't have the things that is needed to correct a really, to have a good outcome for Aboriginal people in this country. I don't know why, because we have educated, put people through all this education. We've helped build communities. You know, you can do all those things and at the end of the day, the government will come back and still slap you in the face when they put interventions in. And you know, and with those interventions, it may not be in your state or your territory, but at the end of the day, it drifts down eventually, because somewhere along the track, someone has to pay for that intervention, and it's the Aboriginal people themselves. Now, you know, you don't need funding to let people know that the wrongs are still wrong. You don't need funding to do that. The fight's gone out of the belly. The fires. So the field officers have a job that really, they've got to know their community though, these field officers. They've got to know their community. Because you just can't turn up on the doorstep one day and say, oh, well, I work with the Aboriginal Legal Service. You could get, you know, a slap in the mouth, because they'll say, well, where have you been while I'm going through all this? And of course, that other wonderful word is respect. Always respect the person who needs your help, no matter what it is that this legal service is there to help you for, respecting them.